Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Kathy Hanneback. Welcome to the Imagine Otherwise podcast, which is produced by Ideas on Fire, an academic editing and consulting agency helping progressive, interdisciplinary scholars write awesome texts, enliven public conversations, and create more just worlds. This is episode 15, and our guest today is Vicko Alvarez, the creator of Scholar Comics and CholActivist, two amazing comic projects inspired by Vicko's life, Latina activism, and Chola culture. Born and raised in Dallas, Texas, and currently living on the south side of Chicago, Vicko is one of 5 children born to working-class immigrant parents. The stories told in Scholar Comics reflect a clashing of cultures and generations. The comics use lighthearted and sometimes humorous events to tell otherwise tough stories of growing up Latina in a low-income neighborhood. Scholar Comics' main character is named Scholar, who's raised in the same hood, attends the same low-performing schools, and witnesses the same street brawls as everyone else. However, Scholar is a huge nerd. Scholar is a bookworm who cares about her neighborhood and community. She cares about her classmates, and she cares about her family. She knows her parents struggle to make ends meet, and she knows her streets aren't always safe for playing. What she doesn't know is why. Vicko is here today to talk about comics, about education, social justice activism, and how she uses all three to imagine otherwise. Thanks so much for being with us, Vicko.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
So you're the creator of Scholar Comics, which I just adore. It's so smart and it's so much fun, and it's a really important project in the world. So tell our listeners a little bit about that project and how you came up with the idea for it.
So Scholar Comics, the main sort of aspect of it is the series that I have online. The comics come out once a month, more or less, and it all basically revolves around the story of a character named Scholar. The idea is that she's sort of a middle school aged little Latina girl, sort of just growing up in a neighborhood that's, not so perfect. It's very much a reflection of how I grew up, how many of my friends grew up. And basically sort of battling this duality of a world that's kind of telling her that she's not meant to do much and her wanting to do a lot. Her just sort of like observing her world and the way that it looks at her as a woman, as a Latina, as somebody who's growing up in a low-income neighborhood.
Nice. So why comics as a medium? What drew you to that?
I honestly got into it just for fun. I just thought that it was fun to create, these sort of animated characters. And then eventually it sort of clicked that it would be a perfect medium because of the combination between images and words. I recently decided to pursue an education master's degree, and it just made so much sense to be able to create books or create a story, rather, that is told not just in words, but also with images. And I think it clicked a lot, especially because I was working with young students. And I just noticed that a lot of students don't like to write. But sometimes when you combine images into a writing exercise, they're a little bit more willing to do it. So a lot of it was actually because of my interest in just sort of seeing how it worked in the world of education. And eventually it just became fun for me. I'm an artist at heart. I always loved anything visual. So I just like the idea of taking my love for visual art and combining it with storytelling.
Nice. And there's a fascinating and long history of activist tinted comics, or comics that have a kind of activist or social justice framework to them. I'm thinking of, the feminist comic movement, the lesbian comic movement, starting in the 60s and 70s all the way through today. Do you see Scholar Comics as kind of tapping into that history as maybe one of the current manifestations of that history?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it especially taps into comics that I think are more geared towards people of color. And I've just seen so much on Facebook, so much on these sites for sort of localized crowdfunding of people trying to create more work like this that's geared towards people of color. So I really think that it's just part of this, I guess you would call it, a comic movement. Of artists who are starting to really push for more representation of people of color. And, you even see it in some mainstream comics like, the Black Panther and the movie that's coming out in the next, couple years. And Spider-Man being Puerto Rican now, Afro-Latino. So, I'm pretty excited for it. I'm glad to, like, sort of just contribute my nugget.
It seems like there's been a lot of popular interest in comics lately, right? Like you mentioned Spider-Man and all of these kind of big, Marvel or DC based comics that are getting turned into really profitable movies these days. But it seems like you're also pointing out the limitations of some of those mainstream representations, right? And kind of what is absent and who is absent, whose stories, whose bodies, whose experiences, whose politics don't get to show up in, say, a Marvel movie. And it seems like Scholar Comics is really doing some kind of fantastic work in filling in some of those gaps and pointing out there are other stories that would be really great to hear and learn from in this medium.
Yeah, definitely. I almost feel like a lot of millennials are really nostalgic for their youth, and that's part of the sort of just revival of the comic culture. But yeah, and I think aside from my character being Latina, it's the fact that it also focuses on a Latina who's in a low income neighborhood. I feel like there isn't too much talk of folks who are of comic characters, I guess, that are in that sort of position. So, it's one thing to be a person of color. It's another thing to like tell a story of people who are traditionally overlooked, poorer classes, basically.
Nice. So one of your other creations is CholActivist. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Did it grow out of Scholar Comics? Is it completely separate? How did that come about?
It's a little bit separate but still related. So the whole concept of scholar and cholactivist just came out of, my friends and I sort of joking around about how, we put the chola in scholar, like, yeah, we're from these like quote unquote like rough neighborhoods, the way that people perceive it. But at the same time, like, we're getting these degrees, like we're in academia, a place where people have time and time again told us that we don't really belong. And not only that, like we're also doing something for our communities, doing something to like change the way that society sees us. So there's a scholar character, then this cholactivist character. So it's basically this idea that, okay, sure, we're from these neighborhoods, but we're doing something about it. We are activists in our own communities. And cholactivist, the way that I use it is, unlike Scholar, it's not a series of stories. I use it more for a lot of activist work that I do to create images that I think can be helpful, and can also just resonate with these communities that I care about, right? Like lower income Latinas. So I use cholactivists in posters that have to do with immigration work largely. So the fight against deportations, the Not One More campaign. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. But yeah, I like to she's sort of a grown up version of Scholar, I guess. Scholar's like figuring out her world, she's in school, but Cholactivist is like grown up and doing something about the world that she lives in.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you grew up in Dallas and you're living in Chicago, and this is kind of a key theme in certainly in Scholar Comics, and it shows up in CholActivist too. Have you noticed any kind of significant continuities or differences in the comic scenes there, or the Latino art scenes there?
Yeah, definitely both. Just differences and some similarities. Some similarities, I think, would just be that a lot of what I see as like the mainstream comic world, but also the alternative comic world is still majority white, which, I think a lot of people are creating great work in the alternative scene. It's just I still feel like it hasn't been as inclusive as it could be. People of color and including stories that directly resonate with people of color. Like I definitely think that's a commonality. Um, Differences. I mean, I left Dallas when I was 18, so it's kind of hard for me to figure out what the scene is like now in Dallas. And I feel like most of the comic artists I've connected with are either in the Midwest or the West Coast. So that's a little bit trickier for me to decide. But in terms of the art scene in general, I mean, I definitely think it's a little bit more lively in Chicago, but Dallas is sort of on a come up from what I hear.
Nice.
Yeah.
So, how do you see your work with these comics, but also maybe more broadly, combining academia, art, and activism in the service of social justice?
Dang.
Sorry, it's a big question.
Oh, that's okay. I saw the question and I was like, that's something I really need to think about. Um, but I mean, I think just the very fact that my main character's name is Scholar
Sure.
should sort of answer that. But I think that it tells stories that are just honest. With the Scholar series, I don't, sort of blatantly say, oh, Scholar is a feminist in the making, or I don't say like, Scholar is really upset about living in this poor neighborhood, etc. It's more subtle in the way that I guess I try to get messaging through because I do it through stories, through just sort of like everyday interactions that she has, whether it's watching TV, in the very first comic where there's this novela basically on the TV saying all of the stuff about, this woman who will die without her man, whoever it might be, and Scholar just sort of like, being like, what? Why? Those are like everyday interactions, everyday just activities that I remember always sort of like tilting my head and being like, why? So I think that Scholar Comics series sort of bridges everything through just honest storytelling. There's another one that I put up maybe a couple months ago where there's a new student, Rosita, and the setting is a classroom. So instead of it being the home, we have a classroom now. And, the teacher mispronounces her name. Rosita doesn't even speak English at this point. And, Scholar's sort of the one to like reach out and be like, it's all right. Rosita doesn't even know like how they do Valentine's Day. This was a February comic. So, even that you can get messages of like, we need to do better in our classroom settings in helping, immigrant children get used to this completely new world. So I think that I just do it through honest storytelling.
Nice. And Scholar Comics is a really fabulous example of kind of how art can be used both for individual healing and kind of individual identity work, but also always connected to a broader collective or collaborative work towards social change, right? I'm curious what maybe advice or insight you have for others who are interested in using art or activism or academia for those kind of dual purposes, the individual identity work, but also that kind of structural collective change.
So I like that part about like in your question about individual healing because that's actually how the comic started off. I didn't want to post them online like at all. Like even though they were in comic form, I just thought that some of the stories were too personal for me to like be ready to put them out in the public. And it made me a little nervous because it was my individual form of healing. It made me a little nervous to put it out and have other people look at it and, judge it or even worse, like judge me. So I guess, my first advice would be to like take a chance. Like some of the stuff that ends up being the most personal to us can end up resonating with so many other people. And that's what I learned when I put Scholar Comics out in the public is that there were all these other people who were like, whoa, like that's how I grew up and I have not seen this enough in story form, in comic form. And I think that was something that really helped me just keep going with the comics, is hearing that other people not only wanted to see more, some of them were even telling me that they needed to see more of this. So it was really encouraging. So my main advice would just like to be, recognize what's extremely significant to you, what's really personal to you, whether it has to do with art, academia, activism, or all of it, and take a chance to see if it might resonate with others, put it out there to see who else it might help to provide some individual healing for them.
Nice. And it's scary, right?
Yeah, super nervous.
Especially when it's our own stories, and that it's a different kind of vulnerability, right? Than just putting, the work that maybe the scholarship that we make, or, blog posts we write that are about other people or other things, right? Even if they are very important to us, it's different.
Yeah, I got really nervous when I started including stories about Scholar's mom. I was like, oh my gosh, I literally just drew Scholar's mom just like my mom. Like, we'll see how this goes.
Yeah. How did it go, if I may ask?
I think my mom just sort of thinks that I'm doing, drawings, and she hasn't really paid too much attention to them. But so far, so good, I guess.
Awesome. So this podcast is called Imagine Otherwise, and this brings me to my favorite question that I get to ask guests. And it circles around their vision of a better world, that world that they're working towards when they draw their comics, when they make their art, when they organize their rallies and protests, when they teach their classes, whatever work they do in the world, that thing that they're striving for. So I'll ask you what is admittedly a giant question, but I think a really important one, which is, what's that world that you're working towards? What kind of world do you want?
Oh man, I hope this doesn't sound, I don't know, too, well, whatever. Basically,
go for it. Yeah.
I mean, ideally, I would work towards a world where we don't have to protest anymore. There's always that sign that gets passed around in memes on Facebook that's like, I can't believe I'm still protesting this. It's like, yeah, we shouldn't have to protest any of this stuff anymore. So ideally, it's not just a world where we don't have to protest, but it's a world where we can just enjoy what it is that we love. And from the perspective of an artist, it is really, really hard to enjoy what you love when you're an artist. So many people told me I've been an artist, I feel, since I was a kid. But so many people along the way tell you that's not going to make you money, that's not going to get you out of this neighborhood, that's not going to get your parents, that's not even going to like sort of allow you to pay back your parents' sacrifices. And it's just so hard, especially as an artist, to live the life that you enjoy, create the world that you want to see, at least for yourself, if not for others. And I think ideally I would just love to be in a world where like your passion is something that you can really pursue. It's something that not only makes you a living but makes you happy. And yeah, it's something that's very difficult for me right now, but it's something that I'm also trying to create for myself. And I feel like I'm on the way there. I feel like I've surrounded myself with a great community of artists, a great community of musicians, and a lot of us just have so much of this in common. So much of our mindset, our personalities are very similar because of that similar road of people telling us that we couldn't and us doing it regardless, us creating the communities that we want to see, whether here in Chicago, LA, Texas, you name it, we're all creating these little communities that are the world that we want to see. So I'm really hopeful for like those communities becoming larger and larger to eventually be the world that we would want to see in the future.
And it seems like your work in education is a great way to expand that, right? A great tie-in for that, teaching others how to do that too.
Yeah, definitely. I do a lot of comic programs with students, mostly middle school, but some elementary school students. And I just I love looking at the little girls specifically and just being like, you can be an animator, like you can be a cartoonist, because so much is just so much of that stuff I know is not being encouraged anywhere else. So I just love being the one to be like, yes, you can do it. Yes, let's try to get better at this so that you can finally like fulfill this, dream that everybody tells you is probably silly.
Nice. Well, I think that is a great place to end on. So thank you so much for being with us and sharing your fantastic work.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. This was fun.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Editing for this episode was done by Julie Leonard. Be sure to check out our website at imagineotherwise.com to listen to full episodes, read show notes, and see links to the people, books, and projects discussed on the show. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes.